Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, we're taking a look at the best decks the best decks currently in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. And honestly, this format makes me sad. So, we're just going to do the quick rundown of some decks, not every deck, and just go over what is best, what is going to get you the highest ranks, and overall what is going to perform the best. That's pretty much it. We're going to start with Ancient Gear, and Ancient Gear is, I don't know, it's Rogue, I guess. It's okay. It's pretty decent due to the fact that it has the ability to go second, which is okay right now, but, like, it's not great, right? Its biggest issue is that it doesn't really play very well into, like, hand traps, right? And things like Droplet just absolutely slaughter it, so very difficult for it to really do all that well. And then on top of that, it's just like everyone is prepared for a going second to deck and are playing much more like go first heavy combo decks, which Ancient Gear is not as equipped to deal with. It can, but there's a better deck to do that with. Next up, we have Branded. Branded, I think, is still in tier 2. It still has the ability to, quote-unquote, Gimmick Puppet lock you. I know it's not actually Gimmick Puppet anymore, but, like, it could still do that. There are still ways of doing that. So, that's a thing. But then on top of that, more specifically, I think that it does have the capability of, like, basically just interacting favorably against a lot of the metagame. I think as of right now, like, yes, Tenpai is frustrating and can still kill through basically anything, but with the way that this deck in particular, with the way that Branded in particular is able to, like, establish boards, I think that it overall has the capability of doing fairly well against Tenpai, especially with the fact that it has the ability to interact with like during the battle phase, which is very nice. Obviously, if they're able to make like Transcendent Dragon, oops. But yeah, overall, I think it's fairly okay. However, with that being said, not insane, just tier 2. Next up, we have Dragon Link. Dragon Link is insane against Tenpai, and is fairly decent against some of the other decks. Borrelend is Borrelend and does Borrelend things, and literally is almost nigh unstoppable into Tenpai. So there's that. As long as they haven't made Transcendent Dragion, you're fine. Actually, even if they have made Transcendent Dragion, you can literally just wait for your opponent to do the Trident Dragon stuff. Well, actually, no. Potentially, you could wait for them to do the Trident Dragon. But yeah, for the most part, it's like you just negate a thing and then it dies during the battle phase, and then they also can't deal with the big boy. So there's that. And since it's also a non-effect, like you can't activate an effect in response to it, it's kind of crazy. So yeah, it's fairly decent. It's not the best, but it's fairly decent. Centurion is okay. I don't think it's nearly as good. I think the Bestials got significantly worse post-ban list and post-Tenpai and stuff like that, which makes it overall pretty mid. However, being able to play like Super Poly is pretty okay and stuff like that. And the end board is fairly decent. It has a lot of big monsters, which can be helpful at the very least. But like overall, it doesn't really play well into like very established boards, which a lot of people are playing now. And it doesn't really have the ability to like play going first and making such a dominant end board that people can't really play through it. So there's that. Next up, we have Chimera. Chimera is terrible. Don't play Chimera. Same thing with the Dinomorphia. Dinomorphia just doesn't really do anything, and it dies to like a singular attack, which is not very good. So there's that. Exosister doesn't really do much, all things considered as well. Mostly due to the fact that like if the opponent is able to interact with the graveyard, that's like if a lot of interaction is coming from graveyard and like from moving cards from grave, Exosister gets a little bit better, but as of right now that's not really necessary, and a lot of decks are able to play Shifter and play through Shifter and around Shifter effectively, so they don't really care. And then on top of that, there's things like, you know, Song and Summoning just immediately cooking any sort of interaction. You know, Harpy's Feather Duster just removing any of the actual gameplay from Exosister. And the fact that they die to, like, singular hand traps sometimes. So it's just, yeah, it's not all that great. Next up, we have Fire King Snake Eye. Fire King Snake Eye is still, like, the best deck. I don't think they got really all that nerfed. Oh, no. Sorry. I was thinking of the TCG ban list. They did. Yeah, Poplar got limited to 1. I'm gonna move them down to tier 2. I think that they're still very good, all things considered. I think the limitations do matter, and I think it does make them weaker overall. But yeah, the 1 Poplar is negligible. Right? You could still just draw the out. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Next up we have M-Pen, or Flunder. Flunder's fine. It's okay. It goes second, which is nice. It's okay. But yeah, it's not insane. Genx is no. Ice Barrier could potentially, in theoretically do stuff. It has a fairly decent idea of what to do when it comes to, or like it has something that it can do fairly efficiently with the what is it? Is it Ryo? Whichever one the like negate is, that like forces the opponent to discard cards. So that one's fairly like that's a fairly good card against Tenpai and against a lot of the metagame just in general. But even with that being said, like it dies to, you know, the removal of a singular monster. Unless that monster goes to grave, most of the time it's just like, yeah, if that monster is removed, it just, yeah, I don't know, you just die. So, yeah, not great into disruption, and can only kind of make a good enough board going first. Infernoid, I think, is fairly decent as of right now. A lot of the metagame is just kind of like, roll the dice, hope that you go first, and if you do, you just kill your opponent, and if you don't, you just die. And Infernoid is really good at that, so it's fairly decent. Infernoid is not good. That deck does exist. Don't play it. Just don't. I know it's got some new cards. The new cards don't do what it needs to do. Like, it does the same thing that it did previously, except now it can do it slightly more consistently. That's it. But, like, it still does the same thing. It still needs to see, like, reasoning. It still needs to see grass. It still needs to see these same cards that do the same thing and to die to the same things. And what happens if you draw a whole bunch of Infernoids? Oh, you lose. Uh-oh. So that's not very good. Cassir does Cassir a thing. What makes Cassir a little bit better, I think, as of right now, than... Well, okay, if we're talking pure Cassir is not very good, and I'm going to keep it in Rogue for that. Cassir as an engine, I think, is a lot better, mostly due to the fact that Unicorn is crazy right now. Because if you resolve Cassir Unicorn to look at the opponent's deck, and your opponent is on Tenpai, you can rip something like a Bident Dragon out of their extra, and then before they have a chance of getting that second one, you can rip a second one out. So then they're just, like, straight out of luck unless they're playing 3, right? But if that's the case, you could potentially rip the Trident Dragion, you could rip the Transcendent Dragion. There's a whole bunch of things that you could just, like, remove that removes the option for them to really do anything. So, yeah, it's pretty good. Lab, I think, is the first deck that I'm going to solidly put into Tier 1, and the main reason for this is because you can play it very well into Tenpai. And on top of that, it still has the ability to do fairly well going first, which means that against Tenpai it has like a really, really good matchup. Against things like Ubel and Rescue Ace, it also has a really good matchup. It does have a pretty bad matchup against like Tearlament and stuff like that. But overall, you can kind of play it in two different ways. You can either play a very like hand trap, kind of like play on turn 0 style of game plan, which is very good into things like Tearlament, or into things like other lab decks or stuff like that, stuff that like are like combo decks, right? Fire King, Snake Eye, etc. But doesn't do very well into like Tenpai and stuff. Or you can play the very trap-centric version, which is very good into like Ubel and Rescue Ace and Tenpai and stuff like that. So those two builds kind of allow you to play in a very unique way, and can really push through whatever matchups you may have a difficult time with, or you're seeing more of, or whatever it may be. The Lightsworn OTK or FTK is does exist still, because Konami just forgot that existed and are just allowing it. The problem is that I think Konami recognizes that the problem card is Snow, and that Snow exists, and they're like, oh no, that's a UR card. We made that card a UR. People are playing 3 of it. We can't just give it back to them, or like give 90 UR dust to them when we ban the card. So now they're just like not gonna ban it, and it's stupid. But like, yeah, it's still an FTK. It still dies to like singular interactions, right? And sure, you could like technically pivot to tier and all of that jazz. But the problem is like, if you don't, or like if you do commit to the FTK and then it gets stopped at like the last second by like an imperm or something like that, it's like, oh, well, good game. So yeah, not exactly great. Voice, I'm also going to put into tier 2. I think it's pretty decent. It has a decent Tenpai matchup with the fact that your monsters are just huge, and having an Omni Negate is pretty nice as well. You also have the ability to just kind of like sit on your monsters, and that's pretty nice. Also, Saravis just absolutely slaughters Tenpai. It's like, cool, nice unaffected monster. Too bad it's not a monster because it hasn't hit the field yet. Smile. So, yeah, Saravis just being able to like banish a guy is crazy. Or like negate the summon is crazy. And there's a bunch of stuff like that Voice's Voice can do pretty well into Tenpai. But it's also not like the craziest. It's still inconsistent. It still dies to singular interactions sometimes. And yeah, it's okay. It's fairly good. Mana Diem is kind of the same thing as Infernoble, but I mean, obviously you could play it as like tier, which is like significantly better, but like the Mana Diem stuff is kind of mid. It's fine. Its item board is just not nearly as strong as the Infernoble stuff, and you might be wondering as to why like I'm putting Infernoble higher, because they're very similar, right? Infernoble has one card in particular that really saves its ass, which is the equip spell Angelic Ring or something like that. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's the equip spell that allows you to basically negate the first spell card at resolution. So with Charlemagne being able to negate the activation of spell cards, if a card were to resolve, like for example, I don't know, Forbidden Droplet, right? They send a monster, they send a spell, it doesn't matter, it's still negated. So that's what makes it so much better than a lot of the other combo decks, is just because like it's not going to die to like a droplet or a super polymerization just randomly, right? So it does have that ability to just kind of like prevent the opponent from playing the game, especially with how many power spells there are. It's very nice. Marincess is just, I hate to say it, Marincess is not very good right now. Mostly due to the fact that Marincess does not play very well going second as of right now, and it lost some of its best interactions with the Toad. With Totally Awesome being banned, and yeah, so right now it's just not great. And like, the going first end board is basically make a big unaffected guy, which is nice, don't get me wrong, that's not bad, but when the opponent can just make a whole bunch of monsters that can just walk over the big unaffected guy, it's not really that big of a deal, right? So, there's that. It also doesn't play well into like a lot of the other top decks, so I'm not even going to put it in Rogue. Next up, we have Mathmech. Mathmech, I think, is pretty decent. Yeah, it has the ability to just kind of like do the Wombo combo end board and end on, you know, a whole bunch of interactions and very problematic monsters, especially for like Tenpai, right? If your opponent makes you go first, you know it's Tenpai, you make Terahertz, then your opponent can't really do a whole lot. I mean, they can, obviously, they could still draw like Droplet or a myriad of other things that just prevent the opponent from, or prevent you from really doing anything, like Imperm and etc., right? So, it's not really like the end-all be-all, but it does have some fairly decent matchups. Its biggest issue is like Maxi, right? Obviously, and stuff like that, and so it still has its flaws, but I think that it's fairly okay. Makanko's not terrible, but like, it also isn't really doing anything. So, it's okay. It's just Ubel, but worse. Anyway, next up we have Paleo. Paleo, I think, is fairly okay as of right now. We'll put it in Rogue. It's okay. It has... Obviously, you can make it, like, very, very good at the Tenpai matchup. Or you could make it, like, fairly decent against some of the other matchups. But it does have some just, like, unwinnable matchups, right? Things like Mathmech, if they go first, it's just like, yeah, that's so many interactions. It's just very difficult to deal with, right? Things like Fire King Snake Eye, things like Inferno, etc. Right? There are decks that it's just like, yeah, you're just not going to be able to beat that realistically. Even Centurion is like a fairly difficult matchup. Also, Lab is just, it's so difficult to beat Lab because Lab just does the Paleo thing, but better. So there you go. But overall, like, it's not terrible. It's not terrible. It's still fun. It's good. There you go. Next up, plants. Plants, I think, are actually pretty decent as of right now. We'll put them in Rogue. Being able to more consistently go first is nice, but, I mean, Max C is still Max C, so I never really am going to put this above Rogue, because, at least until the Roach goes away, then it might be a little bit more playable, but even with that being said, it's not exceptional. Pearly, I think, is actually also fairly good right now. Yeah, it has an insane matchup against Tenpai, mostly due to the fact that the hell is Tenpai going to do against Noir? Like, genuinely. Like, a big-ass Noir just stares at them and goes, and then just, like, waits to battle phase and shuffles away a bunch of shit. So, yeah. It can also just, like, shuffle away, like, the field spell, which is crazy. And then it also has, you know, a whole bunch of hand traps that it could potentially rip. So there's that. Also, going second, it has a fairly good matchup against a lot of the other boards as well, mostly due to the fact that Happy is crazy. Its biggest problem is, like, consistency, right? If you're able to interact with it with, like, hand traps and stuff like that, not very good. It also doesn't do well into, like, set 5 pass, right? Like, trying to play into a set 5 style game plan is really, really problematic. So there's that. Going second, it's not the greatest, right? But it's fairly good overall. Raid Raptor is not very good. Oh, no, I'm not putting it in Rogue. I have no faith in this deck. Same thing with Archfiend. Rescue Ace, I think, is tier 1. I'm going to put it at the bottom of tier 1. I think that it has a lot of really good matchups against kind of a lot of the stuff below it, but not necessarily the stuff right above it, right? Which we'll get to. So overall, like, it's got a good matchup against Voiceless Voice. It has a decent matchup against, like, Pearly. It has a good matchup against... Well, it has an okay matchup against Pearly. It has good matchups against, like, any of the big combo decks, because having those traps really does help. It does, you know, it plays well into, like, hand traps and stuff like that. It can play well into board breakers, whether, you know, big back row removal or monsters and stuff like that. Has the ability to play the non-engine necessary. It's fairly decent overall. Yeah, it's just a solid deck. I don't really know what else to say. It's just good. Next up, we have Ritual Beast, which I think is a fairly decent deck. I'll put it below... I'm actually going to put it below, like, a lot of this stuff. We'll put it in tier 3, at the top of tier 3. I think its biggest flaw is... it's the Roach, right? Like, there's no real game plan for Ritual Beast if the Roach resolves, right? If Max C resolves, you're kind of just hoping and praying that you're able to do something quickly, but it's not always often. The end board is very solid, which is nice, right? But again, a lot of decks are prepared for something like Shifter, so that idea isn't exactly insane. And the end board is strong, but Tenpai can still easily push through it, right? So it's just kind of like give and take. It's solid, but it's not insane, and it has the flaw of being like a big combo deck, but it doesn't really pair well into all of the metagame. It pairs well into some of it. So it's solid. It's a good deck. I'm not going to say that's not, but I just, as of right now, I haven't quite seen how far it could go. I just think it's a nice, solid deck. You're not going to like it. It's not going to be bad, right? Next up, we have Sprite Runic, which is just not good. The Runic cards do not work right now. They are so heavily limited. Speaking of which, Runic Sun, I also think is not good. Runic cards are not very good right now in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. I know Joshua Schmidt is like pilling everyone and being like, yo, Runic Paleo or like Runic XX other deck. No, he's just better. He's just better. Runic cards are not good. They're just not. They're not enough right now, right? All of the like good cards are heavily limited, and it matters a lot, right? So yeah, if you're playing a Runic variant, don't. Hate to say it, don't. Play something else. It's probably going to be better. Speaking of which, I do want to talk about Sprite. Sprite, I think, is still heavily underrated. I think Sprite's very good. Yes, it doesn't have the greatest of matchups into Tenpai, right? But it does have the ability to play through a bunch of hand traps and then end on a bunch of negates. If they don't draw a droplet, it's pretty good, right? But it's not like, again, it's not insane. I've seen what it can do, right? So I'm putting it a tier above Ritual Beast, but it's still at the bottom, right? Ritual Beast could potentially go above it. Sprite could potentially go below Ritual Beast, etc. But I think Sprite right now is just solid. There's a lot of different ways to play. I obviously prefer the Tri-Brigade variant, but you can play it with the Ubel stuff, and you can play more of a Ubel-centric style with that. Basically meaning like you play Nightmare Pain and a few of the other cards as well to basically facilitate that. But overall, like, there's a lot that it can do, right? It also plays fairly decently into Max C, right? A lot of people are holding Max C. They just choose to not immediately fire it during the draw phase or during the standby phase or something like that. And for that, you can end up getting a whole bunch of summons before they actually Max C you, which can matter. So there's that. But yeah, overall, it's very solid. Also, having some sort of, like, spell trap removal that you can search is very nice. So Smashers is like extremely good. But yeah, overall, solid deck. Salamangreat is fine. It's okay. It's a combo deck. It does combo deck things. Sky Striker is... Sky Striker's okay. I think it's not great, but I think it's okay. Mostly due to the fact that it has the ability and capability of going second fairly effectively, which is nice. Right? However, a lot of people are prepared for big power spells and stuff like that, so not exactly the greatest. Stun is not great. It performs fairly well, but, like, no, it doesn't. I think it's just that people really don't like it, but, like, if you actually play against it, most of the time they don't really do anything. And their win condition tends to be pretty bad. So, like, if you go first, it's kind of like an auto win for you. And if you go second, sometimes you could just win anyway, like, really easily. So, it's okay, but, like, it is stun. It's a known quantity. Sword Soul. Yeah, it just doesn't do enough right now. Tier Lament. Tier Lament I'm going to put in Tier 1 as well. I think Tier Lament is still really, really solid. Mostly due to the fact that a lot of people are, like, not prepared for Tier Lament right now. So, I think it's pretty strong. Yeah. And I know it just got hit on the ban list. That does not matter. Not in the slightest. Not really. Right? Because what else was it competing with, right? Snake Eye Fire King, Ubel. Those did get hit, right? And, yeah, those were like the 3 best decks. And now there's a new best deck. And, yeah, Tier Lament is still... Kit Carlos does exist. That is a card that does exist, and you could just use kit colors. It's crazy. Speaking of best decks, Tenpai. Tenpai is the best deck. I'm not going to explain this. We've been talking about it for ages now. It's the best deck. People are preparing for it, so it doesn't look like it's as good as it is. But the thing is, if it doesn't have a target on its back, it's going to kick your teeth in. And it does, even with a target on its back. Even with people absolutely preparing for it, it still just wins. Smile. Like, yeah. It's insane. Next up, we have Almonica, which is a deck that does exist. That's true. Vanquish Soul. Yes, Vanquish Soul is a solid deck that I like, so I'm going to put it in tier 3. And then we have Ubel. Ubel is the second best deck. I think it's very, very solid. I think it has a fairly good matchup into basically most of the metagame. It does really good things in terms of its end board. It has a very solid game plan going second. It can push through boards effectively. It can make boards effectively. It is Ubel. We all know it. We all love it. We all hate it. We all want it to go away, etc. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, yeah. You could also just not play Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, because it's awful. And that's what I would suggest you do. This is, if there is ever a season to not play Yu-Gi-Oh! This is it. Don't play Master Duel right now. Play a different game. Go play Pokemon. Pokemon is fun as hell. Go play Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering is fun as hell. Go play fucking League of Legends. You'd have a better time doing that than playing this right now. I guarantee it. But there you go. That's my tier list. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you guys did enjoy it, and if you did, a like is very much appreciated. Remember to always stay frosty. Bye-bye. Shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.